So contemporary art and emerging media, what do they have in common? Well, it depends what kind of art we are talking about, of course. So I'll share my screen and let's have the presentation, which is over here. Yes, there it is. So I'm talking about contemporary fine art now, because fine art has some specific definitions that goes with it. And so what is contemporary fine art? So where to start talking about it? Like, I've had these conversations with my son, who is saying that he thinks that fine art can be anything and everything. Like, who defines it? Well, that's actually a very good question and a good point. And yes, it can basically be everything and anything, but it's not for the creator alone to say that, okay, this is art. So contemporary art takes many kinds of forms and shapes. Like, for instance, here's an interactive art installation. I assume that when you walk towards that and those animated lines, and they will change. That can be achieved with well, quite simple means, actually. So let's see, if you believe Wikipedia, then this is contemporary art. I mean, well, I copied these bits because I thought they were relevant. So first of all, it's the fine art of today, like produced in this century or the second half of the last century, the 1900s. And they work in a like globally influenced and culturally diverse and technologically advancing world. Yes, that's true too. So they do use different technologies together with the traditional technologies that have been around for thousands of years. And contemporary fine art is typically very international. That in order to be an artist in today's world, you have to have contacts in many different countries. And almost all the artists that I know in Finland, they desperately want to get their stuff shown in international places. Okay, so it's a dynamic combination of materials, methods, concept, and subjects that continue the challenging of boundaries. Yes, so there is a challenging of boundaries of what art can be and what it can't be. And that has been happening for quite some time, since maybe the late 19th or early 20th century, when modern art started. Okay, so also contemporary art is very diverse. And okay, I'm maybe not totally agreeing with this, that it's distinguished by a lack of uniform organizing principle or ism. There are many isms, actually. So, for instance, if you're a video artist, then you're not a media artist necessarily. Okay, but there are lots of frameworks like personal, cultural identity, family, community, nationality. So all of these do matter. Okay, and although there are no isms, there are themes. So here are a couple of isms like migration, globalization, the body, that's being used a lot, by the way, technology, contemporary society, institutional and political critique. Well, that has been around for a long time too. And that's also one of the reasons why contemporary art is seen sometimes as, well, politically dangerous. Here's a nice example, by the way, of environmental art. Like one of my other sons, when I talked to him about contemporary art, he thought first that art is something that you have in a frame, like a painting in a gallery, but it doesn't have to be. It can be like more. Well, this is probably more than almost a kilometer wide. This piece of art, for instance. So who buys this kind of art? Well, it's cities, communities who commission these kinds of artworks from artists. So yes, you can get paid by doing environmental art, but you have to have a name, of course, first. So let's get into the like what defines what is art and what is not art. So it doesn't exist in a vacuum, like I said already. So there are, so let's start from the artist who creates the piece of art. Okay, that's the start. Or it could be also, of course, a commissioned work from, like I said, from a city or from a person. But anyway, then the result is a piece of art. And there is the experiencer of that piece of art who appreciates it, experiences it, sometimes also buys or commissions it. And of course, other artists also belong to this category when they are looking at each other's works. But what they also belong to is the context. And that's what the context is, what validates the piece of art as such. So when I've talked with our art lecturers and other, well, like artists who I know, they have always been like, I have typically asked, like, why, like, is this person's work art or not? I'm asking the stupid questions, you see. And they say, yes, it depends on the context. Like if the context says that it's art, then it is art. So, the context is curators, for instance, of art, or gallery and museum owners. By the way, do you know what a curator is? One of you who are studying art, can you give me a quick definition of a curator? Who is a curator?
I think that a curator, it's a person that kind of can see what is going on in the art world and understand what is going in the contemporary society, and can choose in between like a what is good to represent in a museum.
Yes, exactly. So they are typically working for a museum or for maybe a biennial or triennial art show or exhibition. And they choose like which artists are shown in that exhibition or in that museum, like whose art is commissioned. And they have to know a lot about art and artists, and need to move. And they typically are also very international people who travel a lot. And then what is a piece of fine art? So it has to be non-reproducible and original, or if it's reproduced, then in a limited number. So you typically it can't be reproduced in millions, because a piece of art is also, or can be, an object of investment, which you potentially can buy and then sell again. So if it's like let's say a Disney film, well, that's not a piece of fine art. Although there are thousands of talented artists who have made it happen. But to use the different mediums of art doesn't mean that the work is a piece of fine art. And I'll come to that later. So what does art do then? Can it be anything? So, well, this is my opinion, that I think that fine art does do the same thing than art has done always. I mean, it somehow depicts or reflects the world or the human experience and condition in the world. So it tries to show us how the world is, how we are, or to make us think about ourselves and about the world from different perspectives. So that's my opinion of what fine art is and does, but many people have questioned art as such ever since the let's say 19th century. So why was the 19th century so important? So let's get into the history part of this presentation. So you probably know a little bit about the history of photography. So I searched a little bit and found this image, which was made by Louis Daguerre, the guy who invented the daguerreotypy. I don't know how to pronounce that in English, by the way. It's a specific technique for photography. Anyway, he took this picture, or made the picture with a photographic technique in 1838. And it was the earliest photograph where there are people. Can you spot those people, by the way? Where are they?
Yeah. On the corner left.
In the left corner. So it seems that it's somebody who's shining another person's shoes. And there might be also carriages going here, but they haven't been, they've been moving fast. And some say that there might be also a person in one of these windows, but I haven't seen them. Anyway, photography revolutionized art in the 1800s. Like, if you wanted to have a portrait of yourself or of your wife or children or husband, for instance, then you had to commission a painter, and painters were usually expensive. And if you wanted to have a big portrait, then not many people could afford such a thing. By the way, there were these miniatures that were like that you could put in your pocket that were like just a couple of centimeters high. So they were really popular also because they didn't cost so much as a full-size portrait. But when photography came along, then suddenly it was much cheaper to get like a realistic image of your loved one or your family member. Like this has been made 1 year after the previous photo. So people started taking portraits quite quickly when photography was invented. Of course, photographic techniques had been coming along for a couple of centuries already before photography was actually invented in the 1800s. Some say that even Leonardo da Vinci used some lens techniques as a help for his paintings. It hasn't been proven, by the way, but it's an interesting theory. Anyway, this led to a sort of crisis in fine art, because suddenly there were lots of painters who had got their living from painting portraits of people, and now people were turning to photography. So some painters became photographers, actually, but then people started asking, like, what's the use of painting when you can make quite as realistic images by taking photos? So some would say the obvious answer was to go away from realism in Western art. I mean, art in other cultures had been non-realistic for a long time, and Western art had taken these photographic style realism techniques since the 15th and 16th centuries. Some say again that Leonardo da Vinci and maybe Albrecht Dürer had their hand in that, because they were using lenses. Again, this is a disputed theory, but anyway, when photography came along, then artists started trying out different kinds of depictions of reality. So a camera can't do anything like that, or at least it's quite hard. So this is a way to see the world, a different kind of way to see the world than what a camera can do. So it seemed that fine art did survive the crisis of photography by becoming modern art, but then there was another crisis coming, and so political ideologies where there were movements in the world in the since the 1910s and 1920s that were saying that fine art should depict an ideal world and that people should be shown in ideal light. So that art should show only beautiful people and beautiful things and not ugly things. Well, that was not just about fine art, it was also about photography and film. So then the question was, of course, like, whose ideal world was that supposed to be? Like, there were several ideologies that took this view. But strangely enough, I think the results were always similar. Okay, here's another way to depict an ideal reality. Which is like this painting is using some of the techniques of Impressionism, by the way, but in another setting altogether. So it's, well, I think here's a big influence of film techniques and also photography, which have been used for painting, but there's also, of course, the ideological part. So here, again, so this time there are some traditional painting techniques used together with more modern ones. But the question is, like, is this the truth or just what one wants to be shown as the truth or the idea of a truth? So art is not necessarily neutral, and it's a powerful technique to bring around ideas and ideologies, even now. So here's something that happened in the Western world in the 1950s, where fine arts and contemporary art went into total abstraction. It was called abstract expressionism. The interesting thing here was that the CIA was actually sponsoring abstract expressionist art. But you probably knew that. Okay, let's get into modern days. Like, I was talking about the context, like I mentioned the curators of exhibitions, the context, also art schools, they define what modern art is. Also, there's the community of established artists and art critics, and everybody else who belongs to that context. So they, like, together say what is fine art and what is not fine art. So there are no parties or states as such saying that, okay, this is fine art and this is not. So here's a work by Charles Sanderson, who's an artist from Tampere. He has also taught in the TTVO, which which you probably have heard of, was the school that was pre-TAMK. And well, I think Charles is still living in Tampere and doing his art, but he's an international artist. I think he came from Scotland in the early 90s to Finland. Okay, then people often ask me, and I also sometimes ask our fine art lecturers, like if concept art is considered to be fine art or not. I mean, this is concept art for a game from 2017 called Pollen Art, and it uses a lot of the same techniques than fine art does, but it's not considered to be fine art. Although there are concept artists who make their living by selling their art, that might be game-based, or maybe sometimes it could be called fan art, but which bases again on a game or maybe a movie. So why is that not considered to be fine art? Well, it's usually made for an illustrative purpose. So, and that makes it applied art. So applied art are typically illustrations, which are not made by and for themselves. So they are from something that exists or for something else that exists, for instance, for games. So they are not within the context of fine art.
Carita, may I interject?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to speak about this applied art because, well, typically the institutions, there are fine arts academies that are doing only fine art, and then there are only those who focus on applied art, which is also not just concept art, but there's also textiles, interiors, doing all these like furniture, and it has always been like a very vast division there between fine art and the applied art, even though frequently you need the skills, like really a high tier skills to produce something for the applied art, but it was always like everyone looks down upon it, like
no, well, not maybe down. If you're one of the makers of applied art, then you don't look down at what you're doing.
Some fine artists, they look down, and in the fine art academies they despise them.
I know, but yeah, because the fine art artists and the applied artists, they often use the same techniques. So there is a distinction between these, and typically applied art is also something that can be reproduced in millions, or like I said, or thousands, and that's also that you can't buy a Disney movie as an investment. You buy just the rights to see it. But a piece of art you can buy and then again sell it further to somebody else. And that's why many fine artists right now, I've noticed, are very interested in NFTs. And you will have a separate lesson on those. Or did you have that already, by the way? No, I don't think so.
Not yet.
Yeah, so you will have that. So we'll brush that subject now, but not really talk about it yet. Okay, so how do you get recognized in the context of fine art. How do you become an artist if you're a young artist, for instance? So first of all, it's a good idea to get an education in some established institution, and often also it's good to go to several of these institutions for exchange studies, at least. That's also for the purpose of creating those links to like internationally, because that's what you need. And please note that I wrote established institution, so it needs to have a name. Like the art studies in Tampere used to have a very good name at TAMK, and before that at the TTVO. But when they discontinued the the title of of artist from the studies, that was a big blow for the school. I mean, now you can study fine art at TAMK, but you will not become, like, your title after your studies will be medianomy. It will not be artist like it used to be. And that made many people in the art world think that Tampere did not have any fine art studies any longer, although the courses were the same and most of the teachers were the same. But suddenly it had become invisible as an institution. I don't know what the situation right now is. Have they been able to make it better in the last 10 years or so? I hope so. I thought it was kind of ridiculous, but that's how it happened. Okay, then you have to get to know people within the field. If you get to know future curators, even better. And many future curators are also students of fine art, by the way. Then, of course, you need to create art that fits the context. So you need to know the game in a way. So usually when I've talked to artists, what they have told me is how to establish themselves. They have to get a reputation for an original style and original theme that nobody else is doing, like their own way of doing things. Like Charles Sanderson, for instance, is using words that he's showing in big spaces, like animated words that he takes sometimes from with the help of artificial intelligence from the internet. And of course, you have to participate in exhibitions. So if you're just doing art on your own, never showing what you're doing, then you can't be established in the context of fine art. So you have to be active and create your career actively. And that's what I think the teachers in TAMK are also encouraging the students to do. Okay, so, and if we think about the content of art and what artists actually do, is, again, I want to stress that this is what artists have always done. Like the artists, if they are good, then they are true to themselves and to their style, and they're original, and they know their technique and become masters of that technique, and somehow the work that they do, it resonates in people's minds. So it's not that they are not doing personal things. They might be very, very personal, but somehow the work is also universal. And yes, art does tell us important things about ourselves and the world. So I said that before, but I'm saying that again. Here is an interactive installation by Simon Bakes, by the way, who has also done interesting things for churches, although he's not a religious person. There was, for instance, a church where where there were angels in the roof that were, well, ceiling actually, not roof, that were moving in the way that when you walked on the floor of the church, the angel would be following you on the ceiling. So also when people are moving in his installations, they change the graphics that are projected on the walls. Simon uses these like very simple movement detection cameras for that. And he's one of the artists who have actually learned to code. So he does all his own coding for these works. The same goes for Charles Sanderson. And now we are coming to the subject of fine art and emerging media, or XR, and fine art, or interactive fine art. So I think positive thing about fine art artists who try out with technology is that they have the mindset to, and also they have time to play around with technology, maybe more than engineers do. So if they are interested in coding, then they just try to find out what can be done with coding, or maybe with AI. So usually, well, what I've noticed is that when artists, there are these interactive pieces in galleries that fine art artists have been making, that's quite possibly often the next big thing that comes out, like in a big way, in mass-produced media, I mean. So that's, so for instance, I talked about the history of photography, like the first people who did try out photography were actually artists themselves. So they dabbled with these techniques. So they were kind of artist engineers. So if you're a games designer, games artist, or graphic designer, or app designer, whatever, it's smart to keep an eye on what's happening in contemporary fine art. Also style-wise, because you could have lots of interesting visual ideas, but also thinking about the technology. So here's a digital poetry game from 2011, for instance. which is happening on a screen. And yes, this can be shown in an art gallery or museum on a computer screen. Here's an augmented reality multiplayer game, which is also an art installation. So you're looking at an almost empty gallery through your iPad or your phone, and then you can see the artwork over there. So obviously you have to download an app first. But this can be also done with simple QR codes, of course. Here's a virtual reality interactive installation where there's a kind of a portal made, and on the other side of the portal there's another museum in another city. So this is from 1995, by the way. So right now we are using these kinds of portals in our everyday lives, for example, right now in Zoom. But in 95, this was something different, that you could see live people on the other side of the Earth and talk with them. Interactive floor projections. Okay, this was also new in the 1990s. These days, I think you have seen these kinds of interactive floor projections as children's entertainment. For instance, in Tampere in Näsinneula, there was such a projection with fish and waves for a long time in the lobby. So when you waited to get into Näsinneula for the elevator, then you could play around with the moving fish. Also, some artists are using GIFs to make their art. And obviously this could be used also very well for NFTs, for example. So not all the art in NFTs has to be horrible. Then here's a website that is Cyberformance. So performance art is like one of the let's say ways of doing fine art. It's also quite old performance art. Many know that Leonardo da Vinci was like a fan of doing performance art. He was before his time in many things. But anyway, let's see what kind of techniques are used in. So these are just some of the techniques. I couldn't put all of them here. So I mentioned performance art. Of course, contemporary fine artists are using painting and drawing techniques that have been around for millennia. Also sculpture, but they are also doing installations, sometimes interactive installations, which you can touch and play around with. Video art has been around since at least the 1950s or 1960s. Animation has been used in fine art since the maybe early 20th century already, as soon as film was possible. Of course, photography, we've talked about that. environmental art. I showed you one example of that. And then there's these traditional manual printing techniques that are still in use, like lithography, for instance. But then artists are also using something, they are doing interactive media art, like interactive installations. Some are using robotics that or biotechnology. There's cyborg art even, and some artists are doing video games. And obviously they are not then distributed in a big way, but in limited numbers. Lots of artists are doing virtual reality or augmented reality. We saw one example or a couple of examples of that. Then there's the crypto art with non-fungible tokens, which, like I said, you will have another lesson about. And some artists are using the internet in many ways. So these are just some of the techniques. So here I put a couple of links, and I'll put this presentation into the Moodle. And after let's have a break soon, and then I will tell your day tasks for today. Okay, I'll stop sharing now.